Hush, Sorcha breathed against the boy's temple, pulling the hood of her cloak tighter around his small shoulders. We are almost through. The Citadel gate was a maw of iron and shadow, and the guard on duty was already turning toward the flicker of lantern light that their passage had disturbed. Sorcha held still. The 5 wolf pups tucked into the deep basket at her hip held still too, as if they understood, as if the silence she had lived inside her whole life had finally become a language they all shared. The boy, Emmerich, pressed his face against her ribs and did not make a sound. He was 4 years old, and he had already learned what most grown men never did, that stillness was its own kind of power. The guard's gaze moved past them. Sorcha exhaled through her nose and walked on. She did not let herself think about where she was going, only about the next step and the next. The Citadel of Dusk Hollow rose at her back, like a man she had once loved, enormous and cold and incapable of asking her to stay. Caspian was somewhere inside those walls. Tonight he would be crowned Alpha King before the assembled packs of 6 territories, and beside him, by the ceremony's end, would stand a mate of his council's choosing, a high-born Omega named Vesna, with a bloodline long enough to be read like a map of the known world. It was not Sorcha's blood. It had never been meant to be. She tightened her grip on the basket and kept walking. The ache in her chest was not new. She had been carrying it for 3 years, since the morning Caspian's elder council had called her before them in the great hall, and explained, with the particular courtesy of people who expected no argument from a mute, that her continued presence near the heir was a disruption to the order of succession. She had understood every word. She had not been able to say a single one back. She never could. Her voice had not come in the way that voices were supposed to. She had silence where most people had sound, and in the Citadel's world, silence was indistinguishable from weakness. She had believed them, then. She had packed her few belongings and gone. But Emmerich was Caspian's nephew, his dead sister Alira's boy, and when Alira's mate had remarried and begun sending the child to work in the Citadel stables at age 3, something inside Sorcha had gone very still in a different way. Not survival stillness, decision stillness. She had found the pups behind the eastern granary 3 days ago, a litter of 5, abandoned when their mother did not return from the ridge patrol. They were small enough to fit in 1 palm each, and they had been shaking. Sorcha had picked them up and kept going. She was done waiting in the Citadel's shadow for someone to notice the cost. The old healer's cottage sat 2 miles past the tree line, in a hollow where the creek bent and the ash trees grew close enough to hold the cold at bay. Marin had delivered half the pack's children and kept her opinions about pack politics in a locked chest in the back of her mind, and she had told Sorcha once that the cottage door was always open for someone who needed it. Sorcha intended to test the truth of that promise before dawn. Emmerich's breathing was slowing against her side as the lights of the Citadel became smaller behind them. One of the pups in the basket gave a thin, sleepy sound, and Sorcha adjusted her grip. "Almost," she said. She never spoke out loud. The word came out soft and broken, the way sounds always did when she tried, the shape of language without the smoothness. But the pup quieted. Emmerich lifted his face. "Is that your voice?" he asked. He did not say it with surprise, only with the deep earnestness of a child asking a real question. Sorcha nodded. "I like it," he said, and tucked his face back against her ribs. She walked faster, because if she slowed down, she would cry, and crying took up air she needed for the next step, and the next. She did not look back. She should not have looked back, but she did. The Citadel blazed with coronation torchlight, gold and orange against a sky just beginning to bruise toward dawn. Somewhere inside those lit halls, Caspian Duskalo was preparing to become the king his people needed. And somewhere deep in Sorcha's chest, beneath the silence and the careful practicality and the 3 years of telling herself she had made the right choice, the mate bond, the one neither of them had ever spoken aloud, pulled like a hook in her sternum. She turned away. She had miles to walk yet. The bond had first made itself known to Sorcha at 17, in the practice yard, on a morning she had only gone to deliver the archivist's papers to the weapons master. Caspian had been sparring. He was not the most elegant fighter in the yard. That honor belonged to his elder cousin, a tall, showy boy named Reval, who fought with the kind of spectacular form that a master had obviously spent years polishing. Caspian fought like a man solving a problem. He thought while he moved. He adjusted. He noticed when something was not working and changed it mid-motion, and Sorcha had stopped at the yard's edge to watch because she had never seen anyone who thought the same way she did, visually, functionally, with their whole body rather than their voice. He had looked up. He had looked directly at her, with the sweat still on him and the practice sword loose in his hand, and the expression on his face had not been the one people usually wore when they noticed Sorcha. It had not been the careful pity or the slight impatience she was accustomed to. It had been recognition, as though he had found something he had been looking for without knowing it was lost. The bond hit her 3 seconds later. She had grabbed the yard fence to keep upright. The papers had scattered. She had thought, with remarkable clarity for someone whose knees had just stopped cooperating. Oh no, Caspian had crossed the yard, crouched down to help gather the papers, and looked up at her with those gray eyes that were darker at the outer rim, almost black. "Are you all right?" he had asked. His voice was low, a careful register, as if he already understood she was not someone to shout at. Ah. She had nodded once. He had handed her the papers. Their fingers had overlapped for 1 second on the edge of the archivist's seal, and the bond had roared through both of them. She had seen it on his face, the slight parting of his lips, the flicker of something profound and alarmed, and then they had both very deliberately not said anything about it, because neither of them knew yet what to do with a truth that large. He had learned her name from the weapons master. She had learned his from every conversation in the Citadel, because he was the heir and she was a mute servant girl, and the gap between those two facts was so enormous that she had spent the first 6 months simply refusing to think about it. But Caspian had a gift for closing gaps. He had found her in the archive, where she spent her off hours because books did not require her to speak. He had sat down across the table and opened a volume of historical pack law and read and not talked. He came back the next week, and the next. Eventually, they were meeting there deliberately. She would leave a note in the weapons master's message box, a single time written in her careful block letters, and he would appear. They talked in writing, passing a small notebook back and forth, and in doing so, they said things to each other that neither of them could have said aloud. He wrote, "I have been told my whole life that the alpha must be absolute, decisive, that the pack reads certainty off his skin like temperature. What they don't say is how much you have to hold alone to give that to them." She wrote back, "I hold everything alone. It doesn't feel powerful. It just feels heavy." He read her words for a long time. Then he wrote, "I know, I'm sorry." And then, underneath, smaller, "You are the only person who has ever said an honest thing to me." They had not kissed until the winter of her 19th year, in the archive, with snow pressing quiet against the high casement windows. He had reached across the notebook and touched her jaw with the backs of his fingers, a question rather than a declaration, and she had answered by leaning into it. The kiss was slow and warm, and so careful, his whole attention gathered into it, nothing performed, nothing for any audience. And when it ended, she had pressed her forehead to his, and closed her eyes, and felt, for the first time in her life, that her silence was something beautiful instead of something missing. The bond had sung. They had met in secret for almost a year. It was not dishonest, exactly. No one had asked them, and there was no formal obligation to declare a mate bond before either party was ready. But it was fragile, the way beautiful things are fragile. It existed in small hours, and archive rooms, and the cold of his riding coat when they stood too close in the stable yard. And then his father had died, and the council had moved with practiced speed to shape the succession, and suddenly, Caspian was not the heir. He was the Alpha King-elect, and every decision about him was also a decision about the Six-Territory Compact and the bloodline requirements of the succession charter, and Sorcha was a mute servant girl with no documented origin beyond the border village she'd been brought from at 12. The council had called her in 3 months later. They had been very polite. They had said, "We are not asking you to sever the bond. We are asking you to absent yourself from proximity until the Alpha has made his formal declaration to another. The bond will recede with distance. This is established fact, Omega." She had stood in front of 4 gray-haired wolves in formal robes, and she had not been able to say a single word in her own defense, and her silence, the thing she had lived in her whole life, had become, in that room, indistinguishable from consent. She had left that evening. She had not told Caspian goodbye. Not because she did not want to, because she knew, with the terrible certainty of someone who understood him, that if she stood in front of him and looked at him, he would refuse. He would choose her over the compact, over the succession, over the Six-Territory peace that his people had spent 40 years bleeding for. He would do it without hesitation. He would burn the architecture of his duty to the ground for her, and she loved him too much to let him. So she had gone in silence, the way she had always done everything. And she had spent 3 years telling herself it had been the right choice, and half believing it, and feeding Emmerich dinner, and walking the eastern ridge at dusk, and carrying the silence like a stone in her chest that she had learned to breathe around. Until now. Until tonight, with the coronation fire at her back, and 5 wolf pups in a basket, and a 4-year-old boy's fist curled in her cloak, and the mate bond pulling like it always did, steady and relentless, not a flame but a tide. She had not stopped loving him. She had never, not for one single day, stopped. Marin's cottage was lit when Sorcha reached the hollow, which meant the old healer was awake, which meant she was expected. Sorcha would ask about that later. She had learned not to be surprised by what Marin knew. The door opened before she reached the step. "I was wondering when you'd arrive," Marin said. Her eyes went to the basket, to Emmerich, and her expression softened into something practical and warm. "Come in, both of you, all 7 of you, I suppose." The cottage was exactly as Sorcha remembered it, cluttered with jars and hanging herbs, warm from a fire that was never entirely out, smelling of pine resin and something sweeter underneath. She set the basket down near the hearth, and Marin was already crouching to examine the pups, who were awake now and pressing small noses to the basket's edge. "Healthy enough," Marin said. "They'll need feeding every few hours for another 2 weeks, but they're past the worst of it." She straightened and looked at Sorcha with eyes that had seen too much to be gentle. "And you? Are you past the worst of it?" Sorcha considered the question honestly. She shook her head. "No," Marin agreed. "I didn't think so. The coronation will be done by noon, and then—" She left the question open. Sorcha found the small notebook she still kept in her coat pocket, a habit from years ago, and wrote, "I don't know yet. I only know I couldn't leave Emmerich there." And I couldn't leave the pups. Marin read it and nodded. You could not leave anything that needed you. That's been your trouble since you were 12. She touched Sorcha's shoulder once, brief and solid. Sleep. We'll manage what comes in the morning. Emmerich had already arranged himself on the hearthside rug, one of the pups curled against his stomach, his eyes closing without argument. Sorcha sat in the old chair beside him and put her hand on his back, feeling his breathing slow. She did not sleep. She sat with her hand on the boy, and her eyes on the fire, and the mate bond aching in her chest, like a bruise she kept pressing with her thumb, and she thought about Caspian, in the Citadel's great hall, with a crown being settled onto his head, and a stranger's name called beside his. She had given him that clean succession, that politically unmarred ascension. She told herself, again, that it had been a gift. It did not feel the way gifts were supposed to feel. The messenger arrived the next morning, just past dawn. Not a Citadel soldier. That was the first thing Sorcha noticed. A young woman in riding leathers, unknown to her, carrying a folded note with no seal. She handed it to Marin without ceremony and stood waiting at the door. Marin read it, and her expression did something complicated. She handed it to Sorcha. The note said, in handwriting Sorcha recognized from every message passed across an archive table, I know where you are. I have known for 2 years. The coronation is postponed. I need you to come to the Citadel. Not as a servant. Not in secret. Please. Below that, after a space, the council did not ask you to leave. I found out 6 months after you were gone. What they said to you, and how they said it, is not something I can undo. But I am asking you now, in my own voice, without them. Come back, Sorcha. And below even that, smallest of all, so small she had to tilt the note toward the window light, I could not put a crown on my head last night. Every time they lifted it, I thought about you walking out of that gate with nothing and me not knowing. I am not a king without my mate. I never was. Sorcha read it twice. Her hands were steady. That was something she was proud of. She wrote, on the back of the note, 3 words, I have Emmerich, and handed it back to the messenger. The messenger looked at what she'd written and nodded. He knows. He sent me here, miss. He's the one who sent Emmerich to the stables when Alira's mate brought him to the Citadel. So you would find him. He knew you'd take the child rather than leave him to that. A pause. He knows you very well, I think. Sorcha stood with the note in her hands for a long time. He had placed Emmerich where she would find him. He had given her something to rescue, because he knew the only thing that would bring her back to the gates was not her own need, but someone else's. He understood her that precisely. She should have been angry about that. She was angry about that. She was also, underneath the anger, so purely seen that her chest hurt with it. She turned to Marin. Go, Marin said. Emmerich can stay with me today. The pups and I will manage. Emmerich looked up from the hearthrug, 1 pup in each arm. Will you come back? He asked Sorcha. She crouched down and put her forehead against his. He smelled like wood smoke and sleep, and 4 years old. Yes, she said, in the broken way she said things. I will come back. With the big man? Emmerich asked. She pulled back and looked at him. He came to the stables, Emmerich said, with the matter-of-fact tone of a child reporting observable facts. He didn't talk much either. He just looked at my drawings. I liked him. Sorcha stood. She folded the note and put it in her coat pocket. Then she walked back to the Citadel. The gray of early morning was giving way to pale gold by the time she came in sight of the gates, and the torches from the previous night had burned down to iron stubs. The gate guard recognized her. She had lived inside those walls for 7 years, and faces like hers were not forgotten, and there was a moment of visible uncertainty before he stepped aside. She walked through without stopping. The Citadel's inner courtyard was quieter than it should have been on a coronation morning. Servants moved at careful pace, the kind of practiced restraint that meant something had disrupted the day's schedule. 2 members of the Alpha Council stood near the great hall entrance in close conversation, and they both went still when they saw Sorcha walking across the stones. She looked at them. She did not stop. She did not know precisely where Caspian would be, but she knew this place the way she knew her own breathing. She had scrubbed its floors and climbed its stairwells and sat in its archive for 7 years, and she walked to the room she knew best, the one place in the Citadel where Caspian had always gone when he needed to think without anyone watching. The archive. He was there. He was standing at the long center table, not reading, just standing, with both hands flat on the table's surface, looking at the far wall of shelved volumes. He had not yet changed from his ceremonial preparation. He was in the formal gray and silver of his house, the kind of clothes that cost more than Sorcha had earned in a year of service, and he looked both enormous and entirely alone in that way that had broken her heart the first time she noticed it. The door's sound made him turn. He had gone still in the way he always went still when she entered a room, not frozen, not surprised, but collected, as though every scattered part of him was returning to its correct place. The mate bond hit them both simultaneously. 3 years of distance had not diminished it. If anything, it was sharper, the way a hunger sharpens with prolonged absence, turning from background ache to acute physical need. Sorcha felt it in her sternum, in her palms, moving up the column of her throat. Caspian crossed the room. She had intended to speak first. She had composed sentences on the walk through the forest, careful words she had arranged and rearranged, things about choice and sacrifice and the difference between leaving freely and being maneuvered out. She did not get to say any of them. He stopped 2 steps from her, close enough that she could feel the warmth he always ran, the particular heat of an alpha who held a great deal inside. His eyes moved over her face with the attention of someone accounting for loss, taking inventory of all the time that had passed, cataloging what it had cost. "You're cold," he said. His voice was low. She had walked 2 miles in early morning air. She probably was cold. He shrugged off the formal gray overrobe and put it around her shoulders without asking, and the warmth of it, and the scent of it, pine and iron, and the particular scent of him that the bond made feel like home, went through Sorcha like a sound. She pulled the notebook from her coat and pressed it into his hands. He looked down at it. He turned it over once, recognizing it. Then he looked up at her with something in his face she had never seen there before, something less controlled than his usual register. 3 years, he said. It was not an accusation. It was a measurement. She held out her hand for the notebook. He gave it back. She wrote, "They told me the bond would recede." He read it. It didn't. She wrote, "No." He said, "I looked for you for 8 months. I had people in every settlement within 3 days' ride. You didn't leave a trail." She had been careful about that. She looked at him steadily and did not apologize. He reached out and touched her face, her jaw, the backs of his fingers, the same gesture from the archive in her 19th year, and this time she was not a girl gripping a fence to stay upright. She was a woman who had survived 3 years of deliberate solitude and walked back through a gate of her own choosing, and the gesture landed on her like something restored. "Tell me what they said to you," he said. She wrote it out. All of it, every word she remembered from the council chamber, The blood requirements, the succession charter, the established fact of bond recession, the particular courtesy of people who expected no argument from a mute. He read every word. When he finished, he set the notebook down with a care that was itself a kind of rage, held precisely so it would not scatter. "They had no authority to do that," he said quietly. "The succession charter specifies Alpha's choice as binding over council recommendation. They knew that. They relied on your silence because they believed you could not contradict them." He looked at her. "And I was not there to contradict them either. And that is on me, Sorcha. I was deep in grief, and I trusted the structure around me, and I failed to notice what was being done in the spaces I wasn't looking." She picked up the notebook and wrote, "I left because I thought you would give up the compact for me." He read that and said, very simply, "I would have." She wrote, "I know. That's why." His exhale was sharp. He turned away from her and put his hands back on the table and stood like that for a moment, the same posture she had found him in when she arrived, but now she understood it differently. He was not thinking, he was holding. "So you gave me the kingship," he said, not turning. "At the cost of yourself, and you expected me to, what? Be grateful, reign successfully, forget." She did not write anything to that. There was nothing to write. He turned. "I held the compact together for 3 years," he said. "I ruled, I negotiated, I maintained every agreement my father ever made, and added 12 more. I did the work, but I want you to understand something." He came back to her, not touching, close. "None of it, not a single morning of it, did not begin with me thinking about you. You did not give me the kingship free and clear. You gave me the kingship at a cost I did not agree to pay and was not asked about. You made a sacrifice on my behalf without my consent, and I have been furious about it for 2 years." The mate bond was so loud in Sorcha's chest that she could barely organize her thoughts. She picked up the notebook. She wrote, "You put Emmerich in the stables." He looked at what she'd written. A muscle moved in his jaw. "Yes." She wrote, "You knew I would find him. You knew I couldn't leave him. You used my nature to pull me back, the same way they used my silence to push me out. What is the difference?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The difference is that I am asking, not arranging, not concluding. I am standing in front of you, asking you to stay, with nothing hidden and nothing managed, and if you say no, I will—" He stopped. He pressed his lips together. "I will honor it, but I won't pretend it won't break something that can't be repaired." Sorcha looked at him. She thought about the archive and the notebook and the particular quiet of sitting across from someone who had never once required her to be other than what she was. She thought about 3 years of the mate bond pulling at the center of her chest like a compass needle that would never, under any circumstances, point north. She thought about Emmerich on the hearthrug with a wolf pup in each arm, asking if she would come back with the big man. She put her hand on Caspian's chest. His heart was going very fast. She could feel it through the formal silver and gray. His hand came up and covered hers, completely, his hand much larger, warm and certain. "Sorcha," he said. And the way he said her name was the way he had always said it in her 19-year-old imagination, before she had trained herself out of imagining things. She reached up with her free hand and pulled him down by the back of his neck. The kiss was not like the one in the archive years ago. That one had been a question. This was an answer, thorough and unhurried and warm, with both of his hands at her face and her fingers twisted in the silver-edged collar of his formal robe, and the mate bond doing what it had been trying to do for 3 years, completing a circuit, settling every vibrating thing into its right frequency. When they broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers and held it there, and they both breathed, and the archive around them was absolutely silent, except for the sound of that. "I'm not going to hold another coronation ceremony," he said, quiet against her temple. "I held it once without you, and I could not do it. I stood up there with a crown in the air, and all I could think was that you had walked through my gate in the dark with a child and 5 pups and not looked back, and every single person in that hall was waiting for me to become a king, and I was not there. I was in a forest 2 miles away." She pulled back enough to look at him. She reached for the notebook. She wrote, "I looked back, once." He read it. Something crossed his face that she did not have a word for, in written language or any other. "Then you came back," he said. She nodded. His thumbs moved at her jaw. "I am going to say something in that hall," he said, "today, out loud, in front of every pack elder and council member and ambassador currently eating the coronation breakfast my kitchens apparently kept preparing, even after I refused to take the crown last night." A pause. "And I would like you to be standing beside me when I say it. Not behind me, beside." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she wrote, "I have to go get the boy first." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Of course you do." He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face. "And the pups." She held up 5 fingers. Naturally. His hand stayed at the side of her face, and his expression was doing something she had spent years cataloging in the small notebook of herself. Open in the way he was never open in public, warm in the way that his counsel read as cold, because warmth in Caspian ran deep and still rather than visible. He said, "How could I not love every single part of this? You walked out of my gates with my nephew and 5 pups and absolute no noise, and somehow, this is what it took to bring us to the same room." She wrote, because she had to write something, or she would fold entirely. "You put the boy in the stables." "I did," he agreed without remorse. "I told you I was angry, not that I was passive." She pressed her lips together. She was not smiling. She was absolutely smiling. He walked her to the door. At the threshold he stopped and took her hand, turned it over, and pressed his lips to her palm, once, deliberate, in a way that the mate bond registered as formal declaration, as claim, as the thing he had never been allowed to say and was now saying in the oldest possible language. Her fingers closed around where his lips had been. She went to get Emmerich. The great hall was full. Sorcha had known it would be, in the abstract way that she had known the coronation was happening, but standing at the hall's entrance with Emmerich's hand in hers and the reality of 500 wolves watching the dais was a different kind of knowledge. Every important family of 6 territories was represented, elders in formal colors, council members in gray, foreign pack delegates, the assembled hierarchy of everything Caspian had inherited. The high-born Omega named Vesna sat in the front row of the formal gallery with her family, dressed for a ceremony that had now been publicly delayed. Sorcha stood at the back. She had dressed in what Marin had, a clean shift and her own good coat, dark wool, worn at the cuffs. She had braided her hair. She was not dressed for a great hall. She was dressed for herself, and she stood in the threshold and looked at the dais where Caspian was already standing. He saw her the moment she appeared. She watched him exhale. "I have delayed this ceremony by 1 night," he said, and his voice carried in the hall the way it always did. Not loud, but total, the voice of someone whose authority was physical. "I intend to explain why." The hall was extremely quiet. 3 years ago, the Elder Council, acting on behalf of my succession, dismissed an Omega from this citadel using authority they did not have and language they chose, specifically because they believed she could not contradict it. He was not looking at the council bench when he said this. He was looking at Sorcha. Her name is Sorcha. She is my fated mate. She left this citadel because she loved me enough to give me something I did not ask for and would not have accepted if asked. I owe her a debt I intend to spend the rest of my life repaying. The hall made a sound like a held breath being released in stages. Vesna's family exchanged a look. Vesna herself, and Sorcha would think about this later, sat back slightly in her chair and folded her hands, and her expression was not wounded. It was the expression of someone who had suspected something and had just been confirmed. She does not speak the way you are accustomed to, Caspian continued. Her voice is her own, and it is not available to you for your comfort. But she has spoken to me consistently and honestly for 9 years, and I have understood every word. She does not require your translation. He finally looked away from Sorcha to the assembled hall. I am taking the crown today. I will take it as Alpha King, with my mate beside me, and the succession will be secured through our bond, which has been recognized by the old law since before your charter was written. If the council has an objection, they are welcome to bring it before me directly. No one in the council bench moved. Sorcha walked forward. It was a long hall. She had always known it was a long hall. She had cleaned it, she had carried things across it, she had stood at its edges and listened to ceremonies and declarations and the formal business of power. Walking across it toward the dais, with Emmerich's hand in hers and every face in the room tracking her progress, was different from all of those things. It felt like being real. Caspian met her at the dais steps. He held out his hand. She looked at it. She took it. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain, and he turned to face the assembled hall with Sorcha at his side, and the crown that a council member was already crossing the dais to carry made its final arc and settled onto his head in the pale winter light coming through the hall's high casements. The hall moved to its feet. The sound was enormous. Emmerich, who had been very quiet throughout all of this, looked up at Caspian from beside Sorcha's hip. "You're the big man," he said. Caspian looked down at him. Something in his face changed. It opened, in the private way that only happened when no one was performing anything. "I am," he said. "Sorcha said she would come back," Emmerich said. "With you." "She did," Caspian agreed. Emmerich considered this with the seriousness of a 4-year-old processing evidence. Then he reached up and took Caspian's hand on the other side, completing the chain. Emmerich, Sorcha, Caspian, standing on the dais with the hall's sound rolling over them. Sorcha felt the mate bond settle. Not the pulling, aching version she had spent 3 years managing, not the desperate tide of last night or the sharp need of the archive this morning. This was the bond as it was always supposed to be, complete, both of them present, nothing held at distance. It felt like exhaling after years of held breath. It felt like the archive in winter with snow on the windows. It felt like finally. She squeezed Caspian's hand once. He squeezed back 3 times, a thing they had never discussed and did not need to. The ceremony continued. There were formal words from the head elder, and responses from the council, and the traditional affirmations from the pack delegates that Sorcha had heard portions of from hallways over the years. She stood through all of it beside Caspian and did not perform anything. He kept her hand throughout. When the affirmations required his response, he gave them in the same low, total voice. And when the moment came for him to present his chosen mate to the assembled packs, he turned to Sorcha and said her name. Just her name. No title, no descriptor, and she looked out at 500 wolves and did not apologize for a single thing. Emmerich lasted through the formal portion before falling asleep on his feet, and Caspian scooped him up without ceremony and settled the boy against his shoulder, which caused an audible sound of collective warmth to move through the gallery that Sorcha suspected was entirely involuntary on their part. After, in the corridor outside the hall, with the ceremony behind them, and the full formal weight of the day dissolving into people moving toward the feasting hall, one of the council elders, the eldest of the three who had called Sorcha in 3 years ago, stopped in front of her. The elder was a small, very old wolf in gray robes, and he looked at Sorcha with an expression that had traveled a long way from the polite dismissal of that previous meeting. "I believed the charter read as I said," he told her. "I want you to know I believed it. I was not deliberately." He stopped. He looked at his own hands. "No, that is a cowardly distinction. I chose an interpretation that served a preferred outcome, and I used your silence as a mechanism, and I am asking your pardon for it." Sorcha looked at him for a moment. Then she took out her notebook. She wrote, "Thank you for saying that plainly." He read it, and nodded once, and walked away. Caspian, who had been standing close enough to read it too, said nothing for a moment. Then, 3 words, and you made him more honest than he's been in 40 years. She put the notebook away. He looked at her with the expression she had been cataloging since she was 17 years old. "Are you staying?" he asked. She thought about the cottage in the hollow, and Marin, and the 5 pups who needed feeding every few hours for another 2 weeks. She thought about Emmerich, asleep on Caspian's shoulder with one fist curled in the formal silver collar. She thought about the archive and the notebook and the question they had never stopped asking each other across tables and centuries and 3 years of forced distance. She reached up and put her hand over the mate bond point on his chest, where she had felt his heart going fast this morning. It was steady now. She nodded. "Good," he said. He covered her hand with his, and his thumb moved once across her knuckles, and the mate bond sang between them like a thing that had always known it would end here, not broken, not receding, but resting at last in the place it had always been trying to reach. Marin arrived the following week with the pups in a better basket and a look on her face that said she had expected nothing less than this outcome and had simply been patient about it. The pups were growing. Emmerich claimed all 5 of them, by name, with an authority that no one questioned, including the pups. He lived in the Citadel now, in rooms near Sorcha's that Caspian had made available without discussion, because some decisions did not require a notebook. Sorcha found, in the weeks that followed, that the Citadel was different when you moved through it as someone who had been named. Not louder, she was never going to be loud, but present in a way she had not been before, even in the years of her service, visible, occupying the rooms she occupied, her silence understood now, not as absence, but as her particular register of being. She sat in council observations and wrote her questions on paper, and Caspian read them aloud in his own voice, without attribution, until one day an elder turned to her directly and said, "What did you mean by that exactly?" And she wrote the answer, and he read it himself, and neither of them behaved as though this was unusual. It became usual. She was not a queen who made speeches. She was something else, something the succession charter had not exactly anticipated and was now quietly rewriting itself around. She was the mate of an alpha king, present and clear and silent, and her silence turned out to be a kind of authority that the pack, in time, in small ways, over many seasons, found they could not entirely imagine having lived without. On the morning Caspian finally said everything out loud. In the old language, the bonding words, In the archive where all of it had started, it was just the two of them, and the snow on the casement windows, and a notebook with years of honest conversation pressed between its covers. He spoke the words slowly, making sure she heard each one, and then held out the pen. She wrote hers. He read them aloud. The bond completed itself with the warmth of something ancient and unhurried, a tide that had finally reached the shore it had always been moving toward. She pressed her forehead to his and closed her eyes, and in the quiet, she said, in the broken, particular, entirely her own voice, the two words she had been carrying since a practice yard on an ordinary morning. "Found you." He pulled her close and held on. Outside, 5 wolf pups were growing in the Citadel's south courtyard, and a small boy was drawing pictures of all of them, and somewhere in the east corridor, an elder was rewriting a succession charter with a new paragraph, and the Citadel of Dusk Hollow went about its ordinary business of being a place where ordinary things were happening. And in the archive at its center, against the backdrop of shelved volumes and winter light, a fated mate bond finished the sentence it had started 9 years ago in a sparring yard, finally, completely, in the only language that had ever mattered.